Settle in now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen. Let your breathing find a gentle rhythm. Tonight, we drift toward the American frontier, not toward the rattling spurs and galloping horses of dime novels, but towards something quieter, something slower, something human. The Wild West has often been painted as a land of gunfights, dusty trails, and rugged independence. Yet behind the saloons and under the dim lantern light, another world unfolded. It was the world of the brothel, sometimes called the parlor house, sometimes the crib, and often just the house. The women who lived and worked there did not live in the stories of glory that Hollywood later told. Instead, their lives were shaped by survival, by exhaustion, by fleeting comfort, and by a deep yearning for something gentler. So let us wander there together. Slowly. Step by step. To listen. To imagine. To understand. And as we drift, remember, history, when told softly, becomes not just knowledge, but a lullaby. The arrival in a new town. Imagine a western town in the 1870s. The kind built in a hurry. Streets muddy after rain, wooden sidewalks uneven, storefronts painted but already peeling. The sound of boots on planks. A mule braying. A piano somewhere, playing a tune that drifts and fades. And then, a new woman arrives. Sometimes she comes by wagon. Sometimes by train. Sometimes she walks in, dusty and alone, her few belongings wrapped in a cloth bundle. She might have come willingly, lured by promises of quick money and a new beginning. Or she might have been deceived, coerced, even trafficked. The line between choice and necessity was often thin, blurred by hunger and desperation. In the West, where women were far fewer than men, her presence was both wanted and judged. The newspapers might whisper of her arrival, though never kindly. Men might crowd outside the saloon, curious. And respectable wives might turn away, clutching their children closer. Her new home would rarely be grand. In smaller towns, it might be a single room with thin walls, called a crib. Just wide enough for a narrow bed, a chair, and a lamp. In larger towns, it might be a parlor house, furnished with velvet curtains, patterned carpets, and oil lamps that cast soft, golden light. Yet beneath the decoration, the purpose was the same. She was here to sell company, conversation, and her body. On her first night, she might feel a strange quiet. The sound of men laughing downstairs. The clink of bottles. The smell of whiskey drifting up the stairwell. And in her small rented space, she sits on the edge of the bed, folding and unfolding her one good dress, waiting for a knock at the door. Some women cried that first night. Others hardened themselves quickly. Many told themselves it was temporary. Just long enough to gather money for passage home, or to support a child, or to build a new life. But weeks blurred into months, and months into years. This was the beginning. Not of romance. Not of adventure. But of endurance. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the lamplight buzzing faintly, the hush of boots on the stair, and the weight of silence, before the night begins. A typical day inside the brothel. Morning came late inside the brothel. The streets outside might already echo with the hammers of carpenters, the creak of wagon wheels, the crow of a rooster behind some wooden fence. But behind heavy curtains, the house stayed dim. The women were often still asleep, their bodies weary from a night of endless visitors. When they finally stirred, the air was heavy. The smell of whiskey still lingered from the night before, clinging to carpets and hair. The sheets were damp with sweat. Someone coughed in the next room. Someone else stirred water in a basin, splashing their face awake. For many, the day began with cleaning themselves, though water was precious. A tin pitcher poured into a chipped bowl. A cloth dabbed at the face and neck. Soap was scarce, often harsh, sometimes made from animal fat. But even a small wash felt like a renewal. Afterward there were chores. Contrary to the glamorous images later painted of the Wild West madam, the daily grind was simple and repetitive. Floors were swept. Lamps trimmed. Sheets changed, when there were spare sheets. Dresses patched again and again, threadbare from use. The parlor had to be readied for the evening, and that meant women themselves had to become part of the decoration. Painted faces, bright ribbons, hair styled even if their hands trembled with fatigue. Meals were basic. Perhaps coffee boiled until bitter. Perhaps bread, beans, or salted meat. Rarely fresh fruit. Rarely anything green. Women often ate together, quietly, in the back of the house. For some, this was the only companionship that felt real, not purchased, not demanded, not forced. In the afternoons, if there was no business, the house felt heavy with waiting. Some women mended dresses. Some napped. Some sat by the window, looking out at the dusty street, daydreaming about a life beyond. Children passing by might shout insults. Respectable women might avert their eyes. The brothel stood both in the center of town life and apart from it, both necessary and despised. And always, as the sun began to lower, preparations started again. Rouge applied to tired faces. Perfume dabbed on wrists, trying to mask the smell of smoke and sweat. The piano downstairs tuned, or at least coaxed into play. Lamps lit one by one until the house glowed against the darkening street. A brothel's day was not measured in hours, but in cycles of exhaustion and readiness. Work, rest, prepare, work again. Over and over. And when the dusk settled, the brothel seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first boots to step across the threshold, waiting for the laughter and the bargaining to begin anew. And in the distance, the sky turned deep rose, then violet, then black, while lanterns flickered to life, soft and unsteady. The rules of the house. Every brothel had rules. They were not written in law books, yet they governed the women's lives more firmly than any sheriff or judge. In most houses, the madam set them. The madam was often a former working woman herself, older, perhaps too tired to keep selling her body, but skilled enough, shrewd enough, to manage the house. She handled the landlord. She bargained with suppliers. She dealt with police and politicians, often through quiet payments slipped into waiting hands. And to the women who worked under her, she laid down rules. Some rules were practical. No men without payment. No drinking to excess during working hours. No stealing from customers. Other rules were stricter, meant to keep order. No leaving the house without permission, no visitors except those paying, no friendships that might interfere with business. The fines for breaking rules could be cruel. A woman who drank too much might lose part of her night's wages. One who quarreled could be locked out, turned onto the street until she begged forgiveness. Debt was common, debts for dresses, for food, for medicine, all supplied by the madam and added to the tally. Many women discovered they could never quite pay it back. There was also a silent hierarchy. In larger parlor houses, the youngest, prettiest women might be given the best dresses, the front rooms, the wealthiest customers. Others were left with the cheapest cribs, or sent to entertain rough miners and cowboys who could only spare a few coins. It created quiet rivalries, but also strange solidarities. For only those inside the house truly understood the weight of living this way. Some madams were remembered kindly, spoken of as protectors who shielded their girls from violence, who provided them food, even a measure of safety in a harsh world. Others were remembered as cruel, exploiting every weakness, keeping their workers trapped in cycles of debt and exhaustion. Still, the rules kept the house running. They made a space that looked orderly, controlled, safe to customers. Behind the curtains, though, the reality was fragile. A single fight, a single angry drunk, a single raid from authorities could unravel it all. So the women obeyed. They adjusted to the rhythm of bells rung, doors knocked, coins exchanged. They whispered complaints in corners, but fell silent when footsteps neared. And they lived inside the house's invisible walls, where freedom meant less than survival. And as night deepened, and the piano below drifted into another uneven tune, the house itself seemed to hum with those rules, not written on paper, but etched into every lamp, every stair, every sigh. Customers and encounters. When the lamps glowed warm and the piano stumbled into its evening rhythm, the doors of the brothel began to open. And with them came the men. They arrived in many guises. There was the miner, clothes thick with dust, hands calloused from the pick. He might have walked miles, his pay jangling in a small pouch, eager to forget the darkness of the shafts below ground. There was the cowboy, spurs loose, shoulders sore, smelling faintly of leather and horse sweat. His laughter was loud, but his eyes revealed loneliness. There was the shopkeeper, the clerk, the man in a pressed vest who wanted, if only for an hour, to step outside his role of respectability. And sometimes, there was the gambler, the drifter, the man whose smile never reached his eyes. Each man came with a story, though few spoke of it. What they wanted, mostly, was comfort. The comfort of touch, of being listened to, of being called darling, or sweetheart, by someone who knew it was part of the trade. Some wanted to talk more than anything else. To sit on a bed, or at a small table, and let words tumble out, about a lost family, a failing farm, the fear that tomorrow might bring nothing at all. For the women, these encounters were a blur. One man blending into another. Faces that lingered only briefly in memory. A routine of smiles, gestures, whispered words repeated until they no longer felt like one's own. The work was physical, but it was also emotional, holding the weight of another person's loneliness, then setting it aside for the next. Sometimes, though, moments of humanity broke through. A man might bring a gift, a ribbon, a flower, even a book. A miner might fall asleep fully clothed, grateful simply for a warm bed and someone near. A cowboy might share a story of his travels, and the woman, listening in the dim lamplight, might find herself smiling despite her weariness. But there were darker encounters too. Drunkenness, roughness, demands that pushed against the fragile rules of the house. Women bore bruises, hidden under sleeves and skirts. Some cried quietly afterward, washing themselves in cold water that did little to wash away the heaviness. And yet, night after night, the pattern continued. Men came, coins changed hands, the piano kept playing. For the customers, it was a passing visit, a fleeting release. For the women, it was a cycle that wore body and spirit thin. Still, in the hush after a door closed, in the moment when the lamp flickered low, some women allowed themselves to rest their heads back against the wall, to close their eyes for a heartbeat, to imagine, even if only in the fragile space of a breath, another kind of life. And outside, the street quieted, horses shifting in their sleep, while the brothel pulsed softly with footsteps and whispers, like a lantern glowing against the dark prairie night. Health, hardship, and the body's burden. Life inside the brothel was not only measured by coins and visitors. It was measured, too, by the slow wearing down of the body. The frontier was a harsh place for health to begin with. Towns often lacked doctors. Pharmacies, if they existed, were stocked with little more than patent medicines, bottles filled with alcohol, opium, or mysterious powders promising cures they rarely delivered. For women in brothels, whose bodies bore the brunt of long nights and constant strain, illness was never far away. There were the common sicknesses of the frontier, coughs that lingered for months, fevers that spread from one room to the next, stomach ailments from poor food and water. But there were also the hidden sicknesses, venereal diseases that ate away at health slowly, painfully. In the 1870s and 1880s, before antibiotics, these infections often had no cure. Some left women infertile. Others brought years of pain, weakness, and eventually death. The remedies offered were harsh. Mercury pills, carbolic washes, strong doses of alcohol meant to dull the pain rather than heal. A woman might lie in her narrow bed for days, sweating, shivering, while the madam calculated the lost income and debated whether she could remain in the house at all. Pregnancy, too, was a constant shadow. Some women carried their children, raising them in small rooms above the brothel or sending them away to relatives if they were lucky. Others sought abortions, dangerous, illegal, often carried out in secrecy with herbs, sharp tools, or poisons. The risks were immense. Some survived. Others did not. And yet, despite the weight of illness, work continued. A woman with a cough still greeted her customers. A woman in pain still painted her cheeks with rouge. The cycle left little room for recovery. It was not all despair. Some women learned to care for one another, sharing herbal remedies, watching over a sick companion, singing softly to soothe a restless fever. In those small acts, there was tenderness, a reminder that beneath the trade and the rules and the weariness, they were still human, still yearning for gentleness. But the body remembered everything. Every exhaustion, every wound, every long night. By the age of 30, many women looked a decade older. Wrinkles deepened. Eyes dulled. And while the town outside might continue to grow, their own strength slowly ebbed. Still, each morning, life began again. A wash basin. A brush through tangled hair. A dress pulled tight. And the day moved forward, one slow step at a time. And if you picture it now, you might hear the faint sound of coughing down a wooden hallway, the creak of a bed frame shifting, and the endless, steady ticking of a clock that never quite paused. Small escapes and fleeting joys. Amid the heaviness of brothel life, there were still moments that glimmered. Small, almost fragile escapes that reminded the women of who they had once been, or who they still hoped to be. Sometimes it was as simple as a walk outside. Not every madam allowed it, but when errands needed running or when a girl was trusted enough, she might step into the street during daylight. The air, though dusty, felt different beyond the heavy curtains. Sunlight warmed her skin. The sky seemed impossibly wide. She might pass the general store, where bolts of fabric hung in the window, or pause at the post office to send a letter, words scribbled to a family far away, uncertain if they would ever answer. There were also moments of music. In the parlor, the piano stood as both tool and treasure. Some women knew how to play, filling the room with tunes learned in childhood, waltzes, hymns, or simple songs meant for dancing. When the customers were gone, when the lamps burned low, the women sometimes gathered there themselves. They laughed quietly, sang together, or even danced in stocking feet, skirts brushing the carpet. For a little while, it felt like a world of their own. Books, too, made their way into the brothel. A tattered novel passed from hand to hand. A magazine carried west by stagecoach, its pages worn from many readings. Women devoured them in secret, hungry for words that carried them far beyond the town's dusty streets. Some dreamed of becoming schoolteachers or seamstresses. Others spoke of leaving for San Francisco, St. Louis, or New York, cities where anonymity might bring a new start. There was comfort, too, in friendship. Though rivalries existed, bonds often grew strong. One woman might share her last coin to buy another a ribbon. Another might sit up all night with a sick companion, stroking her hair until the fever eased. Together, they whispered stories, shared secrets, and imagined futures, some wistful, some impossible, but all necessary to endure the present. And occasionally, a gentler customer appeared. a man who listened as much as he spoke. One who left gifts not of money but of kindness, a warm coat, a necklace, or simply a word that made a woman feel seen. These rare encounters lingered, carried like embers in memory. Such moments did not erase the hardships. They did not free the women from debt, or illness, or sorrow. But they gave shape to their days. They offered reminders that joy, however small, could still be found, even within the narrow walls of a brothel. And if you imagine the scene now, picture a quiet evening, the house nearly empty, a group of women gathered close by the fire. Their laughter rises softly, mingling with the crackle of the flames, while outside the prairie wind hums low against the window panes. Decline, escape, and what came after. For most women in the brothels of the West, time was both a companion and an enemy. It passed slowly, night after night, yet it carried them forward all the same. And with each year, the work became harder to endure. Youth was prized in the trade. A woman of 18 might be in high demand, courted by miners flush with gold or ranch hands eager to spend their wages. But by the time she reached 30, or even sooner, she was often pushed aside. The men looked for someone younger. The madam, calculating profit, gave the better rooms to the newest arrivals. What then? Some women slipped downward into cheaper cribs, bare wooden shacks along the edges of town, where the curtains were thin and the locks unreliable. There, the coins grew fewer, the dangers greater, the work harsher still. Others, worn thin by illness or exhaustion, simply disappeared, their names unmarked in town records. Yet a few found ways to leave. Some saved their earnings carefully, hiding coins away until they could purchase a small shop or boarding house. Others married, sometimes to customers, sometimes to men who wished to forget the past as much as the women themselves. These marriages could be tender, but they could also be strained by shame, secrecy, and the weight of what had gone before. The most fortunate were those who became madams themselves. By running their own houses, they gained a measure of independence rare for women in the frontier. They managed money, property, even politics, building reputations as sharp, capable, and untouchable. But this path was narrow, and only a handful reached it. For many, escape was not grand. It might mean slipping away in the night, boarding a stagecoach to another town, starting again under a different name. It might mean working quietly as a laundress or seamstress, trading one form of toil for another. The past lingered, though. Gossip clung like dust, and towns were quick to remember. Respectability, once lost, was rarely regained. And yet some women did carve out new lives. There are stories of former prostitutes who became nurses, innkeepers, or even teachers. Stories of women who raised children, telling them nothing of what had come before. Stories of survival, against all odds. The brothels themselves declined as the century turned. Laws grew stricter, reform movements louder, and towns eager to polish their reputations pushed the houses into back alleys or shut them down altogether. But even as the doors closed, the memories lingered, of laughter and sorrow, of music and silence, of women who endured and sometimes escaped. And if you pause, you can almost picture it, a woman stepping onto a dusty road at dawn, her belongings tied in a small bundle. She does not look back at the house behind her. Ahead, the prairie stretches wide, the horizon endless, the air cool and still. She walks forward, step by step, toward whatever might come next. And in the distance, a rooster calls, marking not just another morning, but the fragile promise of something new. Memory, myth, and the stories we tell. When we think of the Wild West today, the images that often come to mind are drawn not from memory but from myth. Brightly painted saloons, gunfighters with quick tempers, brothels with red curtains and women who always seemed carefree, laughing at the piano. These are the images woven by novels, by Hollywood, by television, stories that smoothed over the harsher truths. The reality, as we have wandered through tonight, was far quieter, harder, more fragile. Women lived lives of endurance rather than romance. They balanced on the edge of survival, between debt and illness, between scorn and necessity. Yet their stories, layered in silence, became transformed over time. By the early 20th century, reformers wrote of them as fallen women, cautionary examples and moral tracts. Later, popular writers cast them as glamorous, soiled doves, mysterious and alluring. Both views, in their own way, erased the complex humanity of the women themselves. What was forgotten was their daily fatigue, their small kindnesses to one another, their quiet resilience. And yet, echoes remain. In old-town records, in faded photographs, in the whispered stories passed down through families. Somewhere, a letter from a woman to her sister still survives in an archive. Somewhere else, a faded dress, carefully mended, sits folded in a museum drawer. These fragments remind us that the women were real, not just symbols, but individuals who once walked the wooden sidewalks, laughed softly at inside jokes, and wept quietly in lonely rooms. In the broader memory of the West, their presence shaped towns as much as the blacksmith, the sheriff, or the saloon keeper. Brothels brought money into towns, drew travelers, and in many places stood as one of the first permanent businesses. And though their work was judged harshly, the women themselves left imprints on communities, on economies, on the landscape of history itself. Now, when we tell their stories, perhaps it can be done gently, with an ear not only for the noise of myth, but for the hush of reality. For in that hush we find something deeper, not glamour, not scandal, but survival. And in survival, dignity. So as we close our eyes tonight, let us remember them not as nameless figures in dimly lit rooms, but as people who endured, who longed, who lived in the same fragile rhythms of hope and despair that all humans share. And as the tale drifts to silence, imagine the soft creak of a rocking chair in the corner, the last lamp flickering low, and the wide prairie night stretching quiet and star-filled beyond the window. Now the story rests. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a still road. The West, with all its noise and hardship, grows distant. And in its place comes calm, the hush of nighttime, the warmth of your blanket, the steady rhythm of your own breath. Sleep well, and let history keep watch until morning.